The grand halls of the Zenari Empire's capital shimmered with golden light as the peace summit began. Tall, elegant Zenari nobles stood in their ceremonial robes, their expressions unreadable. At the center of the grand chamber sat Princess Soraya, heir to the Zenari throne. She was regal, poised, and utterly confident. To her, humans were a young, reckless species, nothing compared to the mighty Zenari. Across the room, a group of humans stood, dressed in their formal uniforms. Among them was Captain Ethan Carter, a decorated officer chosen to represent Earth. Unlike the stiff, formal posture of the Zenari, Ethan stood relaxed, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with curiosity. He had studied the Zenari, their customs, and their strict traditions. He knew that humans were seen as unpredictable, emotional, and even weak in their eyes. The summit began with long speeches and polite words, but the tension was thick. The Zenari had never truly respected humanity, and many doubted the peace talks would succeed. Ethan, however, was not one for empty words. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped forward and smiled. "I know what some of you think," he said boldly, his voice carrying through the chamber. "Humans are unpredictable. We are emotional. We are reckless. And you're not wrong. But do you know what else we are? Survivors. Innovators. Fighters." A murmur spread through the Zenari nobles. No human had ever spoken so directly before. Princess Soraya's golden eyes narrowed as she studied Ethan. He was different from other diplomats. He did not beg for peace, nor did he try to impress them. He simply spoke his truth without fear. Soraya found herself curious. The talks continued, but Ethan's words lingered in Soraya's mind. Later, at a formal dinner, she found herself near him. "You speak boldly for someone from a weaker species," she remarked, sipping her crystal blue drink. Ethan chuckled. "I'd rather speak the truth than hide behind fancy words." Soraya raised an eyebrow. "And what truth do you believe in?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "That humans and Zenari don't have to be enemies. That respect is earned, not given. And that maybe, just maybe, we have more in common than you think." For the first time in her life, Soraya had no immediate response. The night continued, but Soraya's thoughts remained on Ethan. Humans were supposed to be simple, yet this one wasn't. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Princess Soraya had always known her duty. She had been raised to rule, to put her people above everything else. But now, for the first time, she felt trapped between what she had been taught and what her heart whispered to her. And the whisper carried a name: Ethan Carter. She stood in the palace gardens, the cool wind brushing against her golden skin. Ethan stood before her, watching her with those deep, unreadable eyes. There was no fear in them, no hesitation. He was always so sure of himself. "You should not be here," Soraya said, but there was no strength in her words. Ethan smirked. "You keep saying that, but you never tell me to leave." She clenched her fists. "Because I do not understand you." He raised an eyebrow. "What's there to understand? I saved your life. I don't regret it." "But why?" she demanded. "You had nothing to gain, no reason to risk yourself for me." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his short brown hair. "Not everything has to be about gain, Princess." Soraya's heart pounded. Zenari did not act without purpose. Every action had a reason. Every move was calculated. But humans followed their hearts. She took a step closer, searching his face. "And what does your heart tell you, Captain?" Ethan held her gaze. "That I'd do it again, 1,000 times over." Soraya felt something inside her shift. She had spent her life surrounded by warriors, by people who only spoke in duty and honor. But Ethan's words were different. They were honest. They were real. A sudden sound broke the moment. Footsteps. Many of them. Soraya turned sharply as Commander Rithar and a group of royal guards marched into the garden. His cold eyes locked onto Ethan. "Step away from the princess, human." Ethan didn't move. "Relax. Commander, we were just talking. Rithar's expression hardened. The Emperor has ordered your removal from the palace. You will leave at once. Soraya's breath caught. What? Rithar turned to her, his voice firm. Your father believes the human's influence is a distraction. He is no longer welcome here. Soraya's hands clenched. You cannot simply send him away like this. It is the Emperor's will. Ethan let out a dry chuckle. Well, can't say I'm surprised. He glanced at Soraya, his expression unreadable. Looks like this is goodbye. Soraya's heart pounded. She had always obeyed, always followed the rules. But now she felt something she had never felt before, the urge to defy. She took a deep breath, her voice steady. No, he stays. The guards froze. Rithar's eyes widened. Princess. Soraya lifted her chin. If my father wishes to remove him, he will have to tell me himself. And for the first time in her life, she chose something for herself. The grand halls of the Zinari Palace were quiet as the peace summit continued the next day. Princess Soraya sat in her usual place, surrounded by high-ranking officials. She listened carefully as the discussions unfolded, but her mind kept drifting back to the human, Captain Ethan Carter. She told herself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. Humans were strange creatures, bold, emotional, and unpredictable. And yet Ethan's words from the night before still echoed in her mind. Across the chamber, Ethan leaned back in his seat, watching the Zinari with a relaxed expression. He could feel their eyes on him. Most of them saw humans as lesser beings, but Ethan didn't care. He had faced enemies far worse than arrogance. When the meeting ended for the day, an official banquet was held in honor of both delegations. The grand hall was filled with rich food, music, and conversation. Soraya stood at the edge of the room, watching as Ethan laughed and spoke easily with those around him. Unlike other diplomats, he didn't hide behind formal words. He spoke freely, as if he truly believed that he and the Zinari were equals. Soraya wasn't sure if she should admire him or find him foolish. As she turned to leave, she heard his voice behind her. Leaving so soon, Princess? She paused but didn't turn. You humans enjoy talking, don't you? Ethan chuckled. We do. It's how we make friends. Soraya finally turned, her golden eyes studying him. Friendship is not a requirement for peace. Ethan shrugged. Maybe not, but it makes peace stronger. Soraya was about to respond when suddenly, a loud explosion shook the hall. Guards rushed forward as a cloud of smoke filled the room. Screams rang out. Soraya's heart pounded as she saw a shadowy figure in the distance, an assassin. Before she could react, a plasma shot was fired, straight at her. Everything happened in a blur. Ethan moved. Without hesitation, he pushed her out of the way, the energy bolt barely missing her. In a flash, he grabbed a fallen guard's weapon and fired back, hitting the assassin in the leg. The intruder collapsed before security swarmed in, capturing him. The chaos settled, and Soraya found herself staring at Ethan. He was breathing hard, his body tense from the sudden attack. He had saved her, without thinking, without hesitation. Zinari were trained to think before they acted. No one in her own court would have risked themselves like that. Yet this human, this reckless fool, had done so without a second thought. Ethan turned to her and grinned. Well, that was exciting. Soraya's expression remained unreadable, but inside, something unfamiliar stirred. Why would a human risk himself for her? And why did she care? Princess Soraya had spent her entire life mastering control over her emotions, her actions, and her thoughts. But ever since Captain Ethan Carter saved her life, that control had started to slip. And she hated it. She sat in the royal gardens, surrounded by glowing flowers and the soft hum of the palace's energy shields. The night air was cool, but her mind was restless. She had been trained to see humans as unpredictable, reckless, and inferior. Yet one human had risked his life for her. And worse, he made her question everything. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn. She already knew. You again. Ethan chuckled. You sound disappointed. Soraya sighed, glancing at him. He stood casually, hands in his pockets, that same confident smirk on his face. No hesitation, no fear, always so sure of himself. Why did you save me? She asked at last. Ethan raised an eyebrow. I told you. It was my choice. A foolish choice. Maybe. But it was mine to make. Soraya shook her head. Zenari do not act on impulse. We think before we move. We do not let emotions guide us. Ethan leaned in slightly. Sounds exhausting. She frowned. It is necessary. He shrugged. Maybe. But it also sounds like you're denying a part of yourself. Soraya stiffened. You think you know me. Ethan smiled. I think you're starting to figure out that you don't know yourself as well as you thought. Her heart pounded at his words. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But was he? Before she could answer, a sharp voice interrupted them. Princess Soraya. She turned to see Commander Rithar, one of the Emperor's most trusted guards. His piercing gaze shifted between her and Ethan. The Emperor requests your presence. Immediately. Soraya nodded, feeling a strange sense of unease. I will come at once. As Rithar turned to leave, his eyes lingered on Ethan. There was no mistaking the cold warning in his stare. Ethan, however, simply smirked. Guess I'm not very popular around here. Soraya sighed. You should be careful, Captain. My people do not trust easily. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. And what about you? Do you trust me? Soraya opened her mouth. To say no, to say trust meant weakness. But the words would not come. Because deep down she already knew the answer. And that truth terrified her. Princess Soraya had always known her path. She was born to rule, trained to be strong, and raised to never let emotions cloud her judgment. Yet now, as she walked through the grand palace halls, she felt something unfamiliar, doubt. The memory of Captain Ethan Carter pushing her out of danger replayed in her mind. His words haunted her. It was my choice. Zenari warriors did not act on impulse. They followed orders, calculated risks, and never let emotions interfere. But Ethan had risked himself without hesitation, and Soraya could not understand why. She reached the Emperor's private chamber, where her father, Emperor Varen, waited. He sat tall on his golden throne, his piercing gaze studying her as she entered. Around him stood high-ranking nobles, their expressions unreadable. You wished to see me, father, she asked, keeping her voice steady. The Emperor nodded. I have heard about the human. He saved you. Soraya lifted her chin. Yes, without him, I might not be standing here. One of the nobles scoffed. A reckless act. Typical of humans. Soraya's eyes narrowed. Would a Zenari warrior have done the same? Silence. The Emperor leaned forward. Humans are unpredictable. They act on emotion rather than reason. I need you to be careful, Soraya. Do not mistake his actions for something greater than they are. She clenched her fists. And what if they mean something more? A murmur spread through the room. The Emperor sighed. Your duty is to your people, Soraya. Do not let distractions weaken you. Duty. That word had always guided her. Yet now, for the first time, it felt like a chain. She bowed her head slightly. I understand, father. But deep inside, she was no longer certain if she truly did. Later that night, Soraya stood on the palace balcony, staring at the twin moons above. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, but her thoughts burned like fire. She had never questioned her duty before, never doubted her path. But now, she heard footsteps behind her and didn't need to turn to know who it was. You shouldn't be here, she said softly. Ethan chuckled. You say that a lot. She finally looked at him. You confuse me, Captain. He leaned on the railing beside her, grinning. I get that a lot too. Soraya exhaled. My father believes you are reckless. Ethan smirked. Well, he's not wrong. For some reason, she almost smiled. Almost. He also warned me not to be distracted by you. Ethan tilted his head. And are you? Soraya opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Because for the first time in her life, she didn't know. Princess Soraya walked through the towering palace halls, her heart heavy with uncertainty. Commander Rithar's sudden summons had left her uneasy, and her conversation with Captain Ethan Carter still echoed in her mind. Do you trust me? She had not answered, because she didn't know. As she entered the royal chamber, her father, Emperor Varen, stood near the massive window overlooking the city. His hands were clasped behind his back, his golden robes shimmering under the soft glow of the palace lights. You wish to see me, father? Soraya asked, keeping her voice steady. The emperor turned to her, his expression unreadable. The assassination attempt has raised concerns. We believe there are enemies within our own ranks. Soraya stiffened. Who would dare betray the throne? That is what we must uncover. The emperor's gaze hardened. But there is another matter that troubles me. Your closeness with the human. Soraya's breath caught for a brief moment. Ethan Carter. Yes, I have seen how you look at him, how he speaks to you without fear. The emperor's voice grew sharper. Humans are reckless. Their emotions make them dangerous. You must not allow yourself to be influenced. Soraya's hands tightened into fists. He saved my life. Perhaps. But was it truly selfless, or is he trying to gain your trust for his own benefit? Soraya wanted to argue, but the doubt in her father's voice made her pause. Was she being foolish? Was Ethan merely playing a role? The emperor stepped closer. You are my daughter, my heir. Your duty is to your people. Do not forget that. Soraya swallowed the rising emotions inside her. She had spent her entire life obeying, following the path set for her. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure if that path was the right one. I understand, father. But even as she spoke the words, they felt hollow. Later that night, Soraya found herself in the palace gardens once more. The cool air did little to calm her restless mind. She heard footsteps behind her. She knew who it was. You always find me, she said without turning. Ethan chuckled. Or maybe you're always waiting for me. She turned to face him, searching his expression for deception, for hidden motives, but found none. Why do you keep coming back? She asked, her voice quieter than usual. Ethan tilted his head. Maybe because you haven't told me to leave. Soraya exhaled sharply. You are impossible. Ethan grinned. And yet here we are. She should have told him to go. Should have walked away. But instead, she stood there, caught between duty and something far more dangerous. Something that felt like the beginning of a choice she had never dared to make before. A heavy silence filled the air. The royal guards, trained to obey without question, hesitated at Princess Soraya's bold declaration. Even Commander Rithar, one of the Emperor's most loyal warriors, seemed momentarily stunned. Princess, you do not have the authority to counter the Emperor's order, Rithar said, his voice sharp. Soraya stepped forward, her golden eyes fierce. I am the heir to the throne. If my father wishes to remove Captain Ethan Carter, he must speak to me directly. Ethan watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. He had seen Soraya strong before, but this was different. This was personal. Rithar's gaze flickered with frustration. He was bound by honor to follow the chain of command. Very well. I will inform the Emperor of your decision. He turned sharply, motioning for the guards to follow. But be warned, Princess. You are treading dangerous ground. Soraya did not flinch. She held her head high as Rithar, and the guards disappeared into the palace. But the moment they were gone, she exhaled, tension leaving her shoulders. Ethan chuckled. Well, that was impressive. Soraya shot him a look. This is not a joke, Captain. Never said it was. He took a step closer. But you stood up to your father's command. That's not something I expected. Soraya crossed her arms. Neither did I. And that was the truth. She had never defied an order from her father before, but something inside her had changed. She could not let Ethan be cast aside like some meaningless outsider. Not after everything he had done. Not after what she had started to feel. Ethan watched her carefully. You didn't have to do that, you know. Soraya met his gaze. Yes, I did. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Before either of them could say more, a soft beeping sound came from Ethan's communicator. He tapped it and frowned. That's strange. My security clearance just got revoked. Soraya's stomach tightened. That means my father is preparing to force you out. Ethan sighed. Well, can't say I'm surprised. He looked at her, his voice quieter. But what about you? Are you ready for what comes next? Soraya hesitated. Was she ready? If she continued down this path, she would be challenging her father's will. She would be standing against the traditions of her people. And for what? She looked at Ethan. For him. She took a deep breath. No, but I will be. Ethan grinned. That's good enough for me. The moment was brief, but it felt important, like a step toward something neither of them fully understood yet, and neither of them knew just how dangerous that choice would become. Princess Soraya took a step forward, her heart pounding like a war drum. Behind her stood Emperor Varen, the father who had shaped her into a leader. In front of her stood Ethan Carter, the human who had made her question everything. She had made her choice. The Emperor's voice rang out, cold and final. If you walk out that door, you are no longer my daughter. Soraya stopped but did not turn. She had spent her entire life obeying, following the rules of her people, suppressing emotions that made her weak. But now, for the first time, she felt truly alive. She inhaled deeply and spoke with steady resolve. Then I am no longer your daughter. A heavy silence filled the hall. The weight of her words settled like a storm over the palace. Ethan's gaze never wavered. He extended a hand. You sure about this, princess? Soraya looked at him, her golden eyes filled with certainty. I am sure. She took his hand. The guards moved, but the Emperor lifted a hand. Let her go. His voice was heavy, filled with something unreadable. Perhaps disappointment. Perhaps sadness. Soraya didn't look back. She and Ethan walked out of the royal hall together, stepping into the unknown. Outside the palace, the air was crisp, filled with the distant hum of the city. The Zenari people would soon hear of her decision. Some would call her a traitor. Others would see her as a fool. But she didn't care. For the first time, she was free. Ethan squeezed her hand. So, what now? She exhaled slowly, looking at the endless stars above. Now, we write our own future. He grinned. I like the sound of that. As they boarded Ethan's ship, Soraya glanced at her home one last time. She was no longer a princess, no longer heir to the throne. But she was something more. She was herself. And as the ship soared into the stars, she knew this was only the beginning. The palace was tense. Princess Soraya could feel it in the air, the silent pressure before a storm. Her father, Emperor Varen, had not summoned her yet, but she knew it was coming. She stood in her private chambers, staring at her reflection in the polished metal mirror. Was she truly ready to stand against her father? A knock on the door broke her thoughts. She turned. Ethan Carter stood there, his expression serious. We don't have much time, he said. Your father is moving fast. The guards are getting stricter. I think he's planning something big. Soraya clenched her fists. Then I need to face him before he makes his move. Ethan hesitated. You sure about this? She met his gaze. If I don't stand now, I never will. Ethan gave a small smile. That's what I like about you, princess. You don't back down. She turned away, but his words stirred something inside her. This wasn't just about duty anymore. It was about choice, about freedom, and about him. The royal hall was empty except for one man, Emperor Varen. He stood near the great window, overlooking the capital city of Zenara. the twin moons reflected in his golden robes. He did not turn when Soraya entered. "You have been reckless, my daughter," he said calmly. "You have let emotions cloud your judgment." Soraya took a deep breath. "I have made my own decision." The Emperor finally faced her, his piercing gaze sharp as a blade. "And what decision is that?" Soraya stood tall. "Ethan Carter stays. I will not allow you to remove him." A heavy silence filled the room. Then the Emperor exhaled. "You are my daughter, Soraya. You are meant to rule, to lead our people. Do not throw that away for a human." Soraya's heart pounded. "Ethan is not just a human. He saved me. He has shown me things I never allowed myself to see. He has." She hesitated, then continued, "Changed me." The Emperor's face darkened. "Then you are no longer fit to be my heir." Soraya froze. "What? If you choose him, you reject your duty. You will no longer be Princess of Zenera. Asterisk, asterisk, his voice was final. Cold asterisk, asterisk. Soraya's breath caught in her throat. She had known this moment would come, but hearing it, it felt like a blade to her heart. She could walk away, obey, forget Ethan, keep her title, her future. Or she could choose the unknown. Choose herself. Choose him. The doors opened behind her. She turned. Ethan stood there, looking at her, waiting. Soraya took a deep breath. And then, she stepped toward him, toward her future. The assassin had been captured, the chaos had settled, but Princess Soraya was not at peace. She sat in her private chambers, staring at the reflection in the grand mirror before her. The golden markings on her skin shimmered under the soft light, but she did not feel like a powerful Zeneri princess at that moment. She felt confused. A human had saved her life. Captain Ethan Carter. Why? A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. One of her guards entered. "Princess, the human captain wishes to see you." Soraya hesitated. She could have refused, but for some reason, she didn't. "Let him in." The door slid open, and Ethan stepped inside, looking as calm as ever. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, and a faint bruise marked his left cheek from the struggle during the attack. But his eyes still held that same fearless confidence. Soraya stood. "You should not be here." Ethan smirked. "You're welcome, by the way." She narrowed her eyes. "You risked your life for me. Why?" Ethan leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "Isn't it obvious? Someone was trying to kill you." "That is not an answer," Soraya said sharply. "Zeneri warriors do not throw themselves into danger so carelessly." Ethan shrugged. "Well, humans do." She studied him, searching for a deeper reason. Was it duty? Orders? Ethan shook his head. "No, it was my choice." His words struck something deep within her. The Zeneri believed in duty above all else. Everything was planned, calculated, and logical. There was no place for reckless choices. And yet this human had chosen to protect her without a second thought. Soraya stepped closer, her golden eyes locked onto his. "You do not even know me. Would you risk your life for any stranger?" Ethan held her gaze. "You're not just any stranger." A strange tension filled the air. For the first time, Soraya felt uncertain. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever made her question her beliefs. A guard entered suddenly, breaking the moment. "Princess, the Emperor requests your presence immediately." Soraya gave a small nod, then turned back to Ethan. "This conversation is not over." He grinned. "Looking forward to it, Princess." As she left, her heart pounded in a way it never had before. And for the first time in her life, she wondered, was her fate truly written in stone?